The morning sun burned hot over the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Corps medic Sarah Chen adjusted her helmet one more time. The radio crackled with updates from command as her unit prepared to move through the narrow alleyways of the old city. She checked her medical supplies again, making sure everything was secure in her pack. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Chen, stay close to Martinez," Sergeant Williams called out as the squad began moving. Sarah nodded, falling in step behind the machine gunner. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of helicopters breaking the silence. Windows stared down at them like empty eyes, and Sarah felt the familiar knot of tension in her stomach that came before every patrol. The mission was supposed to be routine. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance in this sector, and they were simply conducting a sweep to check for weapon caches. Sarah had done dozens of these patrols over the past 6 months, and most ended without incident. But as they turned the corner onto Market Street, everything changed in an instant. The first shots came from the rooftop of a 3-story building to their right. Sarah heard the sharp crack of rifle fire and saw Martinez stumble forward, blood spreading across his shoulder. Without thinking, she rushed forward to help him, her training taking over completely. She dragged him behind a concrete barrier, just as more bullets began raining down from multiple positions. "Ambush! Multiple shooters!" Williams shouted into his radio. Sarah worked quickly on Martinez's wound, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Around them, the rest of the squad took defensive positions and began returning fire. The sound was deafening, echoing off the narrow walls of the surrounding buildings. Sarah finished bandaging Martinez and was reaching for her rifle when she felt the first bullet tear through her left shoulder. The impact spun her around, and she fell hard against the concrete wall. Before she could even process what had happened, another bullet caught her in the thigh, then another in her side. The world began to move in slow motion. Sarah could see her squad mates firing back at the enemy positions, their mouths moving as they shouted orders she could no longer hear clearly. She tried to move but found her body wasn't responding the way it should. Warm blood was soaking through her uniform, and she realized with growing alarm that she was hit badly. More bullets found their mark. One grazed her neck, another punched through her right arm. Sarah counted them in her head as her medical training kicked in, automatically assessing her injuries even as shock began to set in. 7 bullets so far, and the shooting wasn't stopping. Williams appeared beside her, his face grim as he saw the extent of her wounds. He grabbed her by the armor and began dragging her toward better cover. But the enemy fire was too intense. An 8th bullet caught her in the back as Williams pulled her around the corner of a collapsed building. "Stay with me, Chen," he yelled, but his voice sounded far away. Sarah tried to respond, but found she could barely whisper. The taste of copper filled her mouth, and she realized she was bleeding internally. Her vision began to blur around the edges. The 9th and 10th bullets hit almost simultaneously as Williams tried to get her to the evacuation point. One shattered her collarbone. The other lodged somewhere in her chest. Sarah's breathing became labored and shallow. She could feel her heart racing as her body went into shock. The final bullet, the 11th one, hit just as the enemy fire began to slacken. It caught her in the abdomen, and Sarah knew immediately that this one was different from the others. The pain was intense but distant, as if it was happening to someone else. She could feel her consciousness starting to slip away. Williams and 2 other Marines managed to get her to a semi-secure position in the ruins of an old shop. The fighting continued around them, but Sarah was barely aware of it now. She could hear Williams calling for immediate medical evacuation, his voice urgent and desperate. "Multiple gunshot wounds, critical condition. We need medevac now," he shouted into his radio. But Sarah could see in his eyes that he didn't think help would come in time. The enemy had the area locked down tight, and helicopters couldn't land under such heavy fire. As darkness began to creep in from the edges of her vision, Sarah thought about her family back home in California. She pictured her mother's face, her father teaching her to change a tire in their garage, her younger brother playing basketball in their driveway. She had always known this was a possibility when she joined the Marines, but she never really believed it would happen to her. The sounds of battle grew fainter as Sarah's consciousness faded. Her breathing became more and more shallow, and her heart rate began to slow. Williams stayed beside her, applying pressure to the worst of the wounds and talking to her constantly, trying to keep her awake. "Come on, Chen, don't you quit on us," he said. "We're going to get you out of here. You just need to hang on a little longer." But even as he said the words, Williams knew that conventional rescue was impossible. The enemy had them pinned down, and any helicopter that tried to land would be shot down before it could touch the ground. Sarah's body began to shut down, conserving what little energy remained for her most vital organs. Her pulse grew weaker and weaker, and her breathing became barely perceptible. Williams checked his watch and realized with growing horror that it might be hours before they could safely evacuate her, if at all. As the sun reached its peak overhead, Sarah Chen lay motionless in the ruins of Fallujah, 11 bullets in her body, and life slipping away with each labored breath. Time moved strangely for Sarah Chen as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes, she was back in the rubble of Fallujah, feeling the hot sun beating down on her face and hearing the distant sounds of gunfire. Other times, she was somewhere else entirely, walking through memories that felt more real than the pain coursing through her body. Williams had managed to stop the worst of the bleeding, but Sarah's condition continued to worsen as the hours passed. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had taken on a pale, waxy appearance that made Williams sick to his stomach. He had seen enough wounded Marines to know when someone was dying, and Sarah was closer to death than life. The radio chatter told them that extraction was still impossible. Enemy fighters controlled the high ground around their position, and any rescue attempt would result in more casualties. The best they could hope for was to hold their position until nightfall, when Special Operations Forces might be able to attempt a rescue under cover of darkness. But nightfall was still hours away, and Williams wasn't sure Sarah would last that long. In her fading consciousness, Sarah found herself standing in her childhood bedroom back in San Diego. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and she could smell her mother's cooking drifting up from the kitchen downstairs. She was 17 again, getting ready for her high school graduation. The future stretched out before her like an open road, full of possibilities and dreams. "Sarah, breakfast is ready," her mother called from downstairs. Sarah wanted to answer, wanted to run down the stairs and hug her mother tight. But she couldn't move. The bedroom began to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of concrete debris and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Williams checked her pulse again and found it even weaker than before. He had used all of his medical supplies trying to keep her alive, but there was only so much he could do with field bandages and pressure dressings. Sarah needed surgery, blood transfusions, and intensive care, none of which were available in their current situation. "Come on, Chen," he whispered, checking the bandage over the chest wound that worried him most. "You're tougher than this. Remember that time you carried Rodriguez 2 miles after he stepped on that IED? You didn't quit then, and you can't quit now." But Sarah couldn't hear him anymore. She was somewhere else, sitting in the recruiter's office 3 years earlier. The Marine sergeant behind the desk was explaining the benefits package and asking her about her motivations for joining. Sarah remembered being so sure of herself, so confident that she was making the right choice. "I want to serve my country," she had told him. "And I want to help people. I've always wanted to be a medic." The sergeant had smiled and pushed the enlistment papers across the desk. Sarah signed them without hesitation, her signature bold and confident. Now, lying in the ruins with 11 bullets in her body, she wondered if she would have made the same choice knowing how it would end. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew the answer. She would do it all again, because that was who she was. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on their position. Williams had managed to rig up some shade using a torn piece of canvas, but the temperature was still over 100 degrees. Dehydration was becoming a serious concern for all of them, but especially for Sarah, whose body was already struggling to maintain basic functions. Williams tried to get small amounts of water into her mouth, but most of it just ran down her chin. Her lips were cracked and dry, and her breathing had become so shallow that he had to put his ear close to her mouth to make sure she was still alive. The radio crackled with updates from other units in the area. The enemy fighters were well organized and heavily armed, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Command was working on a plan, but it would take time to coordinate the necessary resources. In her mind, Sarah was walking through the doors of her first duty station. Camp Pendleton was bustling with activity as new Marines reported for training. She remembered feeling nervous but excited, ready to prove herself and make a difference. The drill instructor who met their group was intimidating but fair, and Sarah threw herself into the training with everything she had. "You're going to save lives out there, Chen," the instructor had told her during medical training. "But remember, you can't save everyone. Sometimes the best you can do is be there with them when their time comes." At the time, Sarah thought she understood what he meant. Now she realized she had no idea. Williams noticed that Sarah's breathing had become even more labored. He could see her chest rising and falling in an irregular pattern, and he knew she was running out of time. He had sent several urgent requests for immediate evacuation, but the answers were always the same: too dangerous, too many enemy fighters, wait for nightfall. The other Marines in their unit had taken defensive positions around the ruined building, watching for any sign of enemy movement. They knew that their position was precarious, and if the enemy decided to press their attack, they would be overrun in minutes. But they also knew they couldn't abandon Sarah, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Sarah found herself reliving her last conversation with her parents before deploying to Iraq. They had taken her out to dinner at her favorite restaurant, trying to keep the conversation light despite the weight of what was coming. "Promise me you'll be careful," her mother had said, tears in her eyes. Sarah had reached across the table and squeezed her hand, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I promise, Mom. I'll be home before you know it." But even as she said the words, Sarah wondered if she was making a promise she couldn't keep. Military families always said goodbye knowing it might be for the last time. Williams checked his watch and saw that it was almost 6 in the evening. Sarah had been clinging to life for nearly 8 hours now, far longer than anyone had thought possible with her injuries. Her vital signs were barely detectable, but somehow she was still breathing. The radio finally brought news that gave Williams a glimmer of hope. A special operations team was preparing to attempt a rescue mission. Navy SEALs with specialized medical equipment and air support were planning to reach their position after dark. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "Did you hear that, Chen?" Williams whispered to Sarah, even though he wasn't sure she could understand him. "Help is coming. You just need to hold on a little longer. The SEALs are coming for you." Deep in her fading consciousness, Sarah heard something that might have been Williams's voice, or might have been her father calling her name from across a great distance. She tried to move toward the sound, tried to hold on to whatever thread of life remained in her broken body. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, and darkness began to settle over the ruins of Fallujah. Somewhere in the distance, helicopters were spinning up their rotors, and highly trained warriors were preparing to risk their lives for a Marine they had never met. Sarah Chen was still breathing, against all odds and medical logic, waiting for salvation that might come too late. The helicopters came in fast and low, their rotors barely visible against the star-filled sky above Fallujah. Navy SEAL Team 6 had launched the rescue mission at exactly 2,300 hours, using the cover of darkness to avoid enemy detection. On board the lead helicopter, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez checked his medical equipment one final time. Rodriguez was not just a SEAL operator but also a qualified Navy corpsman, trained in advanced battlefield medicine. He had seen the preliminary reports about Sarah Chen's condition, and he knew that even if they reached her alive, her chances of survival were extremely slim. 11 gunshot wounds and 48 hours of waiting in the desert heat should have been fatal hours ago. 2 minutes out, the pilot announced through their headsets. Rodriguez and his team performed final equipment checks as the helicopter descended toward the landing zone. Intelligence suggested the enemy fighters had pulled back during the night, but everyone knew that could change in an instant. Williams heard the helicopters before he saw them. After 2 days of waiting and hoping, the sound of approaching rotors was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He checked on Sarah one more time and was amazed to find that she was still breathing, though just barely. Her pulse was weak and thready, and her skin was cold to the touch despite the warm night air. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Williams whispered. "The cavalry's here. You're going home." There was no response, but he thought he saw her eyelids flutter slightly. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, but he chose to believe she could still hear him. The helicopters touched down in a whirlwind of dust and noise. Rodriguez and his team moved quickly but carefully toward the ruined building, where Sarah's unit had taken shelter. They used night vision equipment to navigate the rubble-strewn streets, watching constantly for signs of enemy activity. Building secured, came the report from the advance team. Rodriguez hurried forward with his medical bag, prepared for the worst. When he saw Sarah lying motionless in the makeshift shelter Williams had created, his heart sank. She looked more like a corpse than a living person. But when he checked for a pulse, he found one. Weak and irregular, but definitely there. Rodriguez had seen enough battlefield casualties to know a miracle when he saw one. And Sarah Chen's survival was definitely that. No medical textbook could explain how someone could survive this long with these injuries. "Get me IV access immediately," Rodriguez called to his teammate while he began assessing Sarah's wounds. The bandages Williams had applied were soaked through with blood, but they had probably saved her life by preventing her from bleeding out completely. Rodriguez quickly established 2 IV lines and began pushing fluids and blood products into Sarah's system. "Williams, good work keeping her alive," Rodriguez said as he worked. "You probably saved her life with these field dressings." Williams felt a wave of relief wash over him. For 48 hours, he had wondered if he was doing enough, if there was something more he should have tried. The extraction had to be fast. Even though the area seemed quiet, enemy fighters could return at any moment. Rodriguez and his team carefully loaded Sarah onto a specialized medical stretcher designed for helicopter transport. Every movement was gentle but quick, minimizing additional trauma to her already damaged body. "Let's go! Let's go!" the team leader called out as they carried Sarah toward the waiting helicopter. The entire extraction took less than 10 minutes from touchdown to liftoff, but it felt like hours to everyone involved. Once airborne, Rodriguez worked frantically to stabilize Sarah's condition. The helicopter had been converted into a flying intensive care unit, complete with blood products, advanced monitoring equipment, and surgical supplies. Rodriguez started multiple medications to support her blood pressure and heart rate, while continuously monitoring her breathing. "How is she?" Williams asked. He had insisted on coming along on the rescue helicopter, unwilling to leave Sarah after staying with her for so long. "Critical but stable," Rodriguez replied. Though privately, he wasn't sure she would survive the flight to the medical facility. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, and several of the gunshot wounds appeared to have damaged vital organs. The next few hours would be crucial. During the 20-minute flight to the field hospital, Rodriguez performed what amounted to surgery in the back of a helicopter. He managed to stop internal bleeding from at least 2 of the wounds and stabilized her breathing with advanced airway management. It was some of the most challenging medical work he had ever performed. The trauma team at the field hospital was waiting when the helicopter touched down. Sarah was rushed directly into surgery, where a team of military surgeons worked for over 6 hours to repair the damage caused by 11 bullets. 3 of the wounds required immediate life-saving surgery, while the others needed extensive repair work. During surgery, the medical team discovered just how lucky Sarah had been. 1 bullet had missed her heart by less than an inch. Another had barely avoided severing a major artery in her neck. The bullet that had caused her abdominal wound had somehow missed all of her vital organs, lodging harmlessly in muscle tissue. "I've never seen anything like it," the lead surgeon told Rodriguez afterward. "By all medical logic, she should have died hours ago. Those 11 bullets hit almost every part of her body, but somehow avoided causing immediately fatal damage. It's like she had a guardian angel watching over her." Sarah remained unconscious for 3 days after surgery. Williams visited her whenever he could get permission, sitting beside her bed and talking to her about anything and everything. He told her about letters from home, updates from their unit, and his plans for after his deployment ended. On the 4th day, Sarah opened her eyes. Her vision was blurry at first, and she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. But slowly, the memories began to return. The patrol, the ambush, the feeling of bullets tearing through her body. "Williams?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Williams was there immediately, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here, Sarah. You made it. You're safe now." Sarah tried to smile, but found that even that simple action was exhausting. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, and she realized she couldn't feel her legs at all. The recovery was long and difficult. Sarah spent weeks in the hospital, undergoing multiple additional surgeries to repair nerve damage and remove bullet fragments. She had to relearn how to walk, how to use her right arm properly, and how to deal with chronic pain that the doctors warned might never completely go away. But she was alive. Against all odds, medical logic, and statistical probability, Marine Corps medic Sarah Chen had survived 11 gunshot wounds and 48 hours of waiting in the Iraqi desert. The story of her survival spread throughout the military, becoming legendary among the troops serving in Iraq. Rodriguez received a commendation for his role in the rescue mission, but he always insisted that the real hero was Williams, who had kept Sarah alive long enough for help to arrive. Williams was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the ambush and his care of Sarah afterward. Sarah herself eventually received the Purple Heart and was medically retired from the Marines. She returned to California, where she spent months in rehabilitation, learning to live with her injuries. The physical scars healed, but the emotional ones took much longer. Years later, Sarah would become an advocate for wounded veterans, using her experience to help others who had suffered similar trauma. She never forgot the feeling of lying in that ruined building in Fallujah, counting bullets and waiting for death. But more importantly, she never forgot the dedication of the Marines, who refused to leave her behind, and the SEALs who risked their lives to save a stranger. She had learned that sometimes survival isn't about being the strongest, or the smartest, or the luckiest. Sometimes it's about the people who refuse to give up on you, even when giving up would be the logical thing to do. In the end, Sarah Chen's survival was a testament to the bond between warriors and the lengths they will go to bring each other home.